Welcome to the Supplanting overview from the EAC Office of Grants Management. This video is recorded in June 2024, and it covers updated supplanting guidance that goes into effect in July of 2024. In this video, we're going to cover our definition of supplanting, talk a little bit about history, and then go into an in-depth look at our supplanting guidance. That includes exceptions and examples. We'll then touch on an implementation as well as resources. The reason that we've decided to update our supplanting guidance is really to provide more clarity and consistency for EAC grantees. We've seen supplanting come up in a handful of audit findings in the past couple of years, and we want to have a really clear understanding and tool for our grantees to use and for them to use with their subawards. So we know awards made under the Help America Vote Act, that's HAVA, are administered for the purpose of improving or supplementing existing state election activities. HAVA awards are not permitted to replace or supplement state or local funding. We'll use these two words a lot throughout this training. It's important for all federal grant recipients and subrecipients to understand supplanting and how it can negatively impact their program and where it is permissible or unallowable. And that is per the Code of Federal Regulations or the Uniform Guidance. This is our definition of supplanting. It is the reduction of state or local funds for an activity, specifically because HAVA funds are available or expected to be available, without reallocating the reduced funds to another HAVA-related activity. Keep in mind that this is the EAC agency definition of supplanting as it pertains to HAVA formula grants. Each federal agency may have their own definition and guidance for how supplanting pertains to their own programs. EAC formula funds, HAVA formula funds are no-year funds. That means that they have no expiration date. And we have to take that into consideration when we built our guidance for supplanting. This definition mentions HAVA-related activities. Those are expenditures that are allowable under HAVA. This next slide looks at HAVA 101, section B1. And this is those general activities that are allowable under HAVA. A little look at the Virgin history. Up until this point, EAC, Office of Grants Management, advises grantees on supplanting that their overall program budget may not be reduced. That if it's reduced, that may be considered supplanting. If it's not reduced, then it wouldn't. You can see on the right there that we've just specified it a little bit. That supplanting is a reduction of state or local funds because HAVA is available without reallocating the reduced amount to another HAVA-related activity. We do have some exceptions as well as examples that go along with this guidance, and we're going to look at that in the future slides. The next section of the presentation really looks in detail at our guidance. This language comes right out of the guidance document that you can see on the screen, and this is available on the EAC website. We talked a little bit about supplementing funding. Adds to existing funds, state or local funds, and activities to expand the improvement of federal elections. Again, this is allowable. This is what we want to do with our federal grant dollars. Before we dive into our exceptions, just one more look at how we're defining supplanting when it comes to the EAC HAVA formula funds. Remember, it's a reduction of local funding because the availability of HAVA funds without reallocating to another HAVA-related activity. Okay, at this point, we're going to look at some specific exceptions to this. Again, this is all related to HAVA formula grants. And as I mentioned, we wanted to consider that HAVA grants can be really long-term grants. Our programmatic exceptions, we have two. We also have two salary-related exceptions. Our first programmatic exception is the program or activity would not have been provided if HAVA funds were not available. The second is that the state or local funds that had been paying for this program or activity are no longer available. In either case, if a state is referencing one of these exceptions, they need to provide adequate supporting documentation. You need to be able to show to us that there was a reduction, not that it was just because HAVA funding became available. We're going to look at some specific examples of these two programmatic exceptions. The first, a program or activity would not have been provided if HAVA funds were not available. Historically, State X has been responsible for purchasing and mailing absentee ballots. Due to the pandemic, the number of ballots drastically increased, and the additional postage and processing costs far exceeds the state budget. HAVA funds may be used to cover the costs for mailing and processing the ballots. Historically, if something has been paid for with state or local funds, like these absentee ballots, it should be continue to be paid for with state funds, and not doing so may be considered supplanting. In this case, we can see that they have used their state budget for this activity. If they don't use the HAVA funds to cover these unexpected expenses, it wouldn't happen, and the program, and as a result, voters in the community would suffer. So HAVA funds are allowable in this case. Our second exception is the state or local funds that had been paying for this program activity in years past are no longer available. Due to decreased revenue, State X's budget has been cut across many agencies, including elections. The state has, up until this point, paid for annual voting machine maintenance with local funds. The expense has been cut from the budget, and routine maintenance can no longer happen. HAVA funds may be used to continue or re-implement the voting machine maintenance. Next, we're going to look at some personnel and salary exceptions. These are similar. You'll definitely see some overlap here. But because salary comes up frequently when it comes to supplanting, we wanted to have a specific detailed section about it. In general, moving expenses for salaries from state to federal funds is often unallowable. There may be some rare circumstances where it is permissible, and we get into those in the next slides. Exception A, budget reduction. If the state experienced a reduction within their own budget and lost revenue to continue paying for salaries programmatically aligned with HAVA and critical to election administration, they would be eligible to use HAVA funding to fill the salary gaps and ensure program continuity. As outlined in the exceptions above, the budget reduction should be well documented. So this is really similar to that exception number 2 under program. If their budget was reduced across the board and they no longer have the funding to continue paying for part or whole salary of a programmatic person involved in the administration of elections, they can use HAVA to fill that gap. They would need to document this really thoroughly and communicate it with the EAC in advance. Exception number 2, a new or backfilled personnel and salaries. In keeping with expenses related to new and necessary activities allowable and allocable under HAVA, salary costs related to new and necessary personnel would be considered allowable. If a position that was previously funded with local dollars is moved to HAVA, but the original position is backfilled locally, there would be no local reduction of HAVA-related expenses and would not be considered supplanting. Similarly, if a new position is added and also supporting those federal election activities, that can also be paid for with HAVA funding. Next, we're going to move into some more examples. We have 3 to look at. Our first example, State X receives HAVA funding and decides to use grant funds for previously planned purchase of electronic poll books. Subsequently, the state shifts their funding that had been budgeted for those poll books to instead purchase more ballot boxes for the upcoming federal elections. The HAVA funds are used to supplement the state's existing program because the local funding was reallocated to an activity that is allowable under HAVA and confers a benefit to federal elections. You could also look at the overall support for the HAVA activities does not go down. Let's look at the right side of the screen. The state receives HAVA funding, decides to use grant funds for the previously planned purchase of e-poll books. Great. Subsequently, the state shifts funding that had been budgeted for the poll books to instead purchase a civics curriculum for the local elementary school. In this case, those HAVA funds were used to replace the state funds, and those state funds were then moved over to a local funding activity that does not benefit the administration of federal elections. This is supplanting, and it is unallowable under HAVA. Example number 2. State X uses HAVA funds to fully pay for one employee's salary. As a result of an additional HAVA grant, the state decides to use HAVA funds to pay for another existing employee who has the same job responsibilities. The state uses those freed up state funds to hire a third new employee to work on improvements to voter education. HAVA funds were used effectively to supplement in this situation. Looking at supplanting, the state uses HAVA funds to pay for an employee's salary. As a result of additional HAVA money, the state decides to use those grant funds to pay for another existing employee who has the same responsibilities. They use those freed up state funds to hire a new employee to work on campaign finance activities. In this case, HAVA funds cannot be used for campaign finance. We know that's not a HAVA allowable activity. Therefore, they've used federal funds to supplant state funding, and this is unallowable. Looking at our third example here, state used state funds to print ballots for an upcoming federal election, but the printer made an error on the standard ballot form that requires a reprint. The state doesn't have the funding to pay for the reprint before the election and uses HAVA funds. Expenditures were not reduced using HAVA funds to reprint the ballots. The expenditure was necessary for the administration of federal elections and is allowable. On the other side here, State X uses state funds to print ballots. After receiving HAVA funds, the state decides to use HAVA funds to favor printing for an upcoming federal election. The state allocates funding that would have been used for printing the ballots to postage costs for local election mailers. In this case, state funds were shifted to pay for one-time local election costs after receiving HAVA funds. Costs that only benefit local or state elections are not allowed under HAVA. We know that HAVA expenditures must benefit the administration of federal elections. Therefore, this is supplanting and, of course, is unallowable. Just a quick look at our implementation timeline here. Our grantees that have been impacted by this are all of our HAVA formula grantees and subrecipients. That's our election security, election improvement, and requirements payments grants. The effective date is going to be July 15th of 2024. And this guidance may be applied retroactively to grant activities at the grantee's request. We really want this to be beneficial to our grantees, not punitive in any way. And we'll leave it up to our grantees' discretion if they would like to use this retroactively. Again, this isn't a huge change in our guidance. It is a clarification. Our resources are all available on the EAC website, that guidance document that we talked about, this video walkthrough, as well as an EAC FAQ. You are always also welcome to contact the EAC Office of Grants Management for any additional questions. If you suspect supplanting, or if you would like to use one of the exceptions included in the guidance, contact us at grants@eac.gov. Thank you.